on social media and also in the mainstream media, mainly paid for by white monopoly capitalist money, we are consistently confronted with the fake news propaganda stories that white monopoly capitalism and also the term radical economic transformation had been designed specifically by a British PR company called Bell-Pottinger in order to bamboozle the South African population and make them believe that they are being exploited by white monopoly capitalists. Now, this is the biggest load of poppycock that I've ever heard. The term white monopoly capital has been in use within the liberation movement's language, and specifically from the South African Communist Party, in the 1950s and formally started being used in 1962. The South African Communist Party referred to the term white monopoly capitalism in its publication The Road to South African Freedom in 1962. I want to read the following quote. "The 3 million whites hold a monopoly of political rights and economic opportunities. They alone can vote and be elected to parliament and other governing bodies. They are fortified behind a wall of privilege in the civil service, in jobs and professions, in educational opportunities, and 100 other fields." They then continue to say the following: "Effective economic domination in South Africa is thus exercised by an alliance of local white monopoly interests in mining, industry, and agriculture, together with foreign imperialists and representatives of state monopoly capitalism. These interests have conflicts among themselves, which are reflected in the main white political parties and groupings. But they find common cause and ground in the perpetuation of the colonial type subjugation of the non-white population." They continue to talk about how this manifests itself in the concept and in the practice of white monopoly capitalism. In a very interesting paper that had been written 4 years ago by Professor Chris Malekani, Professor of Economics at the University of the Witwatersrand, he traces the definition, the use, and the subsequent attempts of denialism with regards to the concept of white monopoly capital. Early on in the article, he also points out how this concept was used by President Nelson Mandela many, many years ago, even before he was tried and imprisoned through the Rivonia trial. President Nelson Mandela in the early 1960s wrote in the New Age the following, and I open quote, "The system of white supremacy has its roots in the cheap labor of the major economic groups in our country. South Africa's economy is dominated by giant monopolies in the gold mining industry, linked with big financial and farming interests whose tentacles reach also into secondary industry. These groups have been responsible for the reserve system, migratory labor, the low wage policy, and much more in terms of exploitation of the majority of black people. These groups own and control the national wealth of our country and determine the basic structure of the South African state." Close quote. President Mandela then continued to say, "If tomorrow every discriminatory law on the statute book were repealed, but the mineral wealth, monopoly industry, and financial empires were not transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole, the system of white supremacy would in its basic essentials be perpetuated for many generations. Sadly, this is exactly where we find ourselves at this juncture. So to say that the concept of white monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation, which is the tools that we need to formulate in order to get rid of this strangled grip of the white monopoly capitalists on our economy and the continued exploitation of the majority of black and especially African South Africans, are concepts that have been developed by a British PR firm, cannot be further devoided from the truth. We must ask ourselves, how did this fake narrative about the use of radical economic transformation and white monopoly capitalism in the analysis of our South African situation came about? Certainly, it cannot be argued that a British PR firm that had been started in 1987 by a certain Lord Pottinger can now be made responsible for the use of these concepts. Let me start with some personal experiences I had with regards to the PR company Bell-Pottinger. In 2008, as we were preparing for the 2009 national elections, there were some comrades within the ANC who had the harebrained scheme that it may be useful to bring in Bell-Pottinger as a PR company to assist us with our election campaign. I was brought by some of these comrades to a meeting at the Hyatt Hotel in late 2008, where I met together with them Lord Pottinger. From the beginning of that meeting, I was appalled by the idea that we as the liberation movement in South Africa would try to ask for the public relations advice and campaign advice for the elections that was forthcoming from one of the most reactionary public relations firms in the world, a firm that made common cause with Margaret Thatcher when she was destroying the Mine Workers Union of Arthur's Cargill, and formulated most of the policy programs in terms of how it was set out in the public relations environment for Margaret Thatcher. It was a contradiction in terms that we as a liberation movement, committed to the empowerment, especially of workers, committed to the black poor and the African poor in specific terms, could even contemplate the possibility of working with a scumball such as Lord Pottinger. At the end of the meeting, I made my views very clear, that I will not be prepared to work with Lord Pottinger or his reactionary PR firm on any election program for the African National Congress. Fortunately, that did not happen. Lord Pottinger was sent on his merry way, and he was not involved in our election campaign in 2009. Later on, out of the blue, Bell-Pottinger re-manifested itself as now being contracted by the Gupta family in order to fight some of the battles that they were faced with in South Africa. I hold absolutely no brief for the Gupta family. I've never met them. I've never engaged with them on any particular project or anything with regards to the political future of our country. What I can say is that I find it shameful that there were some comrades within the African National Congress who saw it fit to cooperate with Bell-Pottinger in order to try and deal with some of the problems that the Guptas were faced with in terms of the way in which they were attacked for their involvement in the South African economy. It is particularly shameful that this reactionary right-wing PR company started to use legitimate concepts in terms of the understanding and the analysis of our South African socio-economic situation in order to try and defend the Gupta family. I've distanced myself many times from this kind of situation, and I find it despicable that important concepts which really deals with the essence of understanding the economic dynamics that we are faced with in South Africa had been abused by Bell-Pottinger and by the Guptas. But while we talk about the Guptas, let me say one thing as a side footnote. The Gupta family and the allegations that are made about state capture from them need to be investigated. But I'm 100% convinced that the essence and the heart of the problem of state capture cannot be found with that family. If we want to understand the issue of state capture, it has to be understood in the context of the centuries-long colonial capturing of South Africa, of the resources of South Africa, and the impoverishment of the majority of black and especially African South Africans. That had not been done by the Guptas. That had been done by primarily Anglo-American, British and American colonial interests, together with a sprinkling of white colonial Boer activities. If you want to talk truly about state capture, you need to talk about the role of Harry Oppenheimer, of Anton Rupert, the father of Johann Rupert, of course also of Johann Rupert, of Koos Becker, of Stephen Kosseff, and I can continue to mention the list of those who are truly the controllers of white monopoly capital in South Africa and the real state capturers. Compared to them, the Guptas are nothing more than just a small spaza shop. What has been happening is that the Gupta family and some of their allegedly illegal or corrupt activities have been used as a way to deflect our attention from the real state capture in this country. It has also been used in order to move us away from an understanding of what the true economic dynamics in South Africa are. I want to read an extract from Apartheid South Africa, Colonialism of a Special Type in 1987. This is a document deeply infused by the thinking of the Alliance and especially by the thinking and analysis, and at that stage there was still true class and communist analysis in the South African Communist Party, when the following was said, and I quote, "This is why the ANC has always considered the two economic clauses of the Freedom Charter as essential." And when it says this, it talks about the critical issues of addressing the consequences of colonialism also of a special type, and the manner in which the majority of black people, and especially African people, have been not only disenfranchised, but have been prevented from being able to have any control over the South African economy. And it refers to those two extremely important economic clauses in the Freedom Charter. Firstly, that the people shall share in the country's wealth, And secondly, that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. That this must be the very core of the ANC's program, not only for liberation in terms of getting one person, one vote, but also for full economic liberation. These clauses envisage the seizure of economic assets presently owned and controlled either by individualist capitalists or capitalist companies drawn exclusively from the white minority or white transnational corporations. White monopoly capital in South Africa has in fact been the principal beneficiary of the post-1994 period. They are the ones that benefited from the stabilization of our state once sanctions had been removed and there was a restoration of profitability. And many of our major corporations have used this period to transnationalize, and some located their headquarters to cities on financial centers outside South Africa. This is an analysis done by the ANC and the South African Communist Party. This is also an understanding that is being undermined when white monopoly capitalist mouthpieces such as the Sunday Times, Business Day, the Financial Mail, etc., try to tell us that there's no such thing as white monopoly capitalism, and tries to tell us that the concept of radical economic transformation was an alien concept imported by Bell-Pottinger. I'm interested that one of the members of the South African government and of the ANC, in fact the Secretary General of the South African Communist Party, Comrade Bladen Nzimande, in 1997 had no problem to recognize the role of white monopoly capitalism. But after 2016 and 2017, especially after the Nazareth conference of the ANC, the 54th National Conference of the ANC, Comrade Blade suddenly suffered from amnesia, could no longer remember the role of white monopoly capital as he acknowledged it himself in some of his own speeches. I want to quote him in an address that he made to the NAFCOC AGM on the 4th of October 2007 at the Durban International Convention Center. I open quote. "The single biggest obstacle to the development of the SME and cooperative sector is the lack of finance. In the South African context, we have a financial sector that is structured and geared towards supporting white monopoly capital." I close quotes. Now here I can cheer Comrade Blade along. But where I cannot cheer Comrade Blade along is when later on, in 2017, he agreed with Comrade Gwede Mantashe of the African National Congress, then the Secretary General of the African National Congress, that there is no such thing as white monopoly capital. In fact, he said at the COSATU Central Committee meeting in 2017, and I open quote again, "There is a new phrase that we do not have, by the way." He says we do not have it. White monopoly capital. It is not anywhere in the documents of our movement. "I'm challenging you to go," he says. "This thing is Gupta inspired." Here he comes and takes over that fake narrative that white monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation were concepts developed by the Guptas and by Bell-Pottinger. So he says it's Gupta inspired by this public relations company, Bell-Pottinger. By the way, that is now also expressed, he says, in the emails that we've seen. But as I've indicated, on several occasions in the past, including that address that he had delivered at NAFCOC, Comrade Blade was very clear, without any problem, to understand what white monopoly capitalism is and how it prevents the majority of black and especially African South Africans from being able to gain control of the South African economy. But now suddenly, he started making common cause with the new liberal positions advanced by the former Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel. Trevor Manuel, knowing very well that white monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation are integral parts of the analytical tools of the African National Congress and its alliance partners with specific reference to the South African Communist Party, found it necessary in 2015 in the Daily Maverick to say the following, and I quote again: "I stand by what I said at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. The term white monopoly capital was conjured up by Bell-Pottinger on behalf of the Guptas and filtered into the political discourse, he claims, to serve their agenda." Now, I'm asking myself, how did it come about that people like Trevor Manuel, Blade Nzimande, and even Gwede Mantashe, and I want to come back to Comrade Gwede because he said something in a 2017 speech that he gave, which I really took strong exception to. But let me ask this question first. How did it come about that these comrades, with their long histories within the African National Congress, as part of our alliance and as part of the liberation struggle, could no longer see what is so crystal clear, evident in the daylight of our South African context, that our economy continue to be controlled by white monopoly capitalists, and that the majority of black and especially African South Africans have absolutely no chance to have any control over this economy as long as this current structure of control by white monopoly capitalism continues. The only answer I can find is that as time went on and the material conditions of these comrades changed, because they started to make increasingly common cause with these big white captains of industry, became more and more involved in shareholdings and in business deals with them, and in terms of those engagements improved their own material conditions to the point where they had become almost a kind of serving class, a comprador capitalist black class that was there to protect and serve the white masters of white monopoly capitalism, that their own material interests became so entangled with the continuation of this unjust and exploitative status quo that they had to move away from the roots of their own engagement and involvement in the struggle for liberation, and that they had to deny, or try to deny, the existence of these concepts of white monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation as important tools of analysis within the ideology and the political history of the African National Congress. That is sad. And that is what I would call a sell-out process. A process of ultimately denying your people their true and full freedom. I've listened to how this gets rationalized. I've listened to what some of the other comrades who follow this same process of thinking and have gone through the same process of having become increasingly the comprador capitalist servant class to the white monopoly capitalists, allowed their thinking to go. Amongst those, I found the current Treasurer General of the African National Congress, Comrade Paul Mashatile, the head of our financial economic cluster, Comrade Enoch Kodongwane, etc., etc. They play important, careful word games. They tell us that our battle is not against white monopoly capitalism. It is not for a fundamental restructuring of our economy as set out through the pro-radical economic transformation resolutions that were taken at the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress at Nasrec. They say our enemy is poverty. Our enemy is joblessness. Yes, of course, we're fighting against poverty. Of course, we are fighting against joblessness. Of course, we want to create jobs. But the real enemy must be a system that causes poverty and causes joblessness, that causes the massive chasm between the rich and poor that we see all over South Africa indeed, where South Africa has become the prime example of inequality, known throughout the world as the most unequal society in the world. You cannot declare the cause, the fundamental, the principled enemy. You have to declare the cause where it comes from. The cause of this poverty is a system. The cause of this poverty comes from the control of the white monopoly capitalists as it developed historically through colonialism, through the stealing of the land from the people, through the 1913 Land Act, through all the legislation that disempowered the majority of black and especially African people and made it impossible for them to be able to compete with their white compatriots, and especially with a small group of white monopoly capitalists in terms of having control over our economy. So the real enemy is not to be described simply as poverty or joblessness. But the real enemy is that system that causes joblessness and poverty, is the continuing control and the stranglehold of white monopoly capitalism over our economy. To deny that is to be disingenuous, to be dishonest, especially when you know that it is different, especially when you come from a political history and an ideological understanding but should make it utterly impossible for you not to understand what is going on. It must only be willful blindness that can lead for someone like Trevor Manuel and Bladen Zamande and Paul Mashatile and Enoch Kodongwane, the lack of sight, the willful blindness that they cannot see the cause of the problem, the issue of white monopoly capitalism. Now, Comrade Gwede Mantashe, I referred to him and said I'm going to come back to this. In his address to the South African Communist Party in Bizo in 2017, when he was then also already the Secretary General of the ANC, said the following: there is an attempt to vulgarize monopoly capital debate. Today, vocabulary talks about white monopoly capital. And then he claims This concept of white monopoly capital is the vulgarization of the revolution. When we then use that vulgarized terminology, he claims, to deal with each other. Now, I don't know how Comrade Gwede get to the point where he can analyze white monopoly capitalism as a vulgarization of the monopoly capital debate. What we know, what I know, what he knows, if he wanted to be honest, is that in the South African Communist Party 1962 program, there was no vulgarity. It was a deeply and carefully analyzed and researched program that resulted from proper class analysis. It was not a vulgar program. And nor was the SACP, when it was still based on true Marxist and classist analysis, a vulgar party. What is vulgar? What is vulgar is to deny the truth that you know in order to serve your newly gained financial well-being and the improvement in your financial conditions. But Marx spoke about this. Marx wrote, together with Engels, that the analysis of people, of the circumstances around them, is determined by their material conditions rather than by intellectual honesty. And this is where I want to end. To try and describe white monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation as concepts that had out of the blue been parachuted into the South African ideological and analytical context by those reactionary PR firm members of Bell-Pottinger is intellectually dishonest. It is a propaganda campaign. It is a fake news program which is trying to get us not to target the real enemy. And those comrades who participate in this kind of fake news, in this denial of the truth, although they know the truth, should be ashamed of themselves. Because the manner in which they try to protect their newly gained financial advancement and interest is what is truly vulgar in this debate. White monopoly capitalism and radical economic transformation has been and should be and must continue to be essential tools in our understanding of who the enemy is and our understanding of the battle plans that we need to develop in order to release ourselves, to free ourselves from the strangle grip that they've maintained over us for many centuries now. I conclude with what Comrade O.R. Tambo, the longest serving president of the African National Congress, shared with us several times. He said it so many times in his broadcasts on Radio Freedom to our nation when we were still subjugated also to the racist apartheid regime's whims, when he told us, comrades, your freedom will not only be defined by the day that you get universal franchise, where you get the vote. Your freedom will ultimately be defined when you gain control over the South African economy and the black majority and African people in particular will be able to control the commanding heights of our economy. We will not be diverted. We will not be sidelined. And the tools of our analysis of who the enemy is will not be removed from our intellectual ability to conclude this revolution.